and my patience, and every word you say to me is just another more wasted. I'm tired of those lies you tell me, lies you tell me.
All right, good evening, everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives. Loving the new microphone. This baby right here is the Shure SM7B. I really like it a lot. And so hopefully the sound quality will only get better as we continue to build out the studio and make things just a little bit better than they were before. Unfortunately, I still don't have all the cadence down with getting the stream to start, so you got to see me probably picking my nose and, playing with the wax in my ear and whatnot. But anyway, so tonight's going to be hopefully it'll be a fun, low-key opportunity to learn about the basics of modern monetary theory. I've done a lot of these types of videos in the past over the last 4 or 5 years, and it always is a little bit different. I try my best not to script these because I feel like when you script them, you try to be too perfect, and I think that there's something to be said for just hey, do I have this down? Can I really give this talk without having to look at a million different things? But I did select 3 key pieces of, one is an article by L. Randall Ray that came out shortly after the Modern Monetary Theory Conference in New York City back in September. The other one is just going to be a touch on Warren Mosler's 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds. And the other one is going to be a short video that I'm going to play. It's kind of like if I play that video, why am I even going to speak? But it's Stephanie Kelton, and there's 10 things that she wants you to know about the economy. And it's from her presidential lecture series at Stony Brook. And I found it to be probably the best of all the different videos. And I've watched all of them, or I've watched a lot of them. I found today I woke up very early and I realized, as much as we talk about modern monetary theory, we need to focus sometimes just on the basics around here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the show off with Stephanie Kelton's, 10 things. Hopefully this is something that you guys can really get your head wrapped around as we go into this. I think it's a good way of setting the stage. So here we go with this. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing started.
The sky is always falling. So what I would like this afternoon to be is essentially a form of group therapy, because we need it, okay? Because they're scaring us with these stories about how it's unpatriotic, how it's burdening the next generation, how it's dooming us to a future of higher taxes, catastrophe for the nation, right? And I want to try to lower the temperature, get us to the point where we can, at whatever age it's legal to do so, open a nice bottle of red wine, read the newspaper, see the headline, national debt is at an all-time high, and have that nice glow about us and feel at peace with the world, right? There's no reason to panic. The government's budget is nothing like a household budget. This is the problem. They're not like us. Their budget doesn't work the way our budgets work. Deficit spending by the federal government isn't the same as you and I spending more than we make year after year. Borrowing by the federal government isn't the same as you and I going out and putting money on a credit card. One of us issues the currency. They do. The other one of us, you and I, are merely using the US dollar. So we have a distinction to make between currency issuers and currency users. The issuer of the currency, the federal government in this case, can never run out of it, can never go broke, can never have bills coming due that it can't afford to pay, can't become insolvent, can't end up like people you may know, right, who took on too much debt and got into trouble and were forced into bankruptcy. My deficit, my red ink, is your black ink. Okay, here it is with actual historical data for the US going back to 1960. The red line is my account balance. Okay, the red line is my financial balance. The black line is the private sector in the US. It's all the households, it's all the businesses in the US combined. And what do you notice? I'm almost always in the red, my budget is almost always in deficit, and yours is almost always in surplus. And not only that, they tend to move opposite one another, meaning when I run bigger deficits, you all end up with bigger surpluses, okay? So my red ink is your black ink. So when you see a headline like this one, right, from the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago, trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal. This is meant to shock and frighten. Trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal, but take a breath and read it this way. Watch the word deficit. Don't you feel better? Don't you feel better? The national debt is all of the outstanding treasury bonds that the government spent the money into the economy, didn't tax it back, and then traded the cash for a different financial instrument called a security, a government bond, okay? So the entire national debt is nothing more than a record, a historical record of all of the dollars that were spent into the economy, not taxed back, and are currently being held in the form of US treasuries. That's all the national debt is. What do we really owe China? So I have a friend who's a bond trader. He's a fixed income guy, trades government bonds, and his name is Warren Mosler. And Warren will often say, the only thing we owe China is a bank statement. Okay, he's being a little bit funny, but essentially at the end of the day, that's about it. Okay, what do we owe China? A bank statement. Okay, we already got the stuff. We traded it for a treasury, and at the end of the day, as long as China wants to orient its economy around exporting in order to grow, in order to create jobs, then we're the beneficiary in this bargain. Eliminating the national debt means eliminating all of those safe securities called US treasuries that people like to hold in their portfolios, because that's what the national debt is. You pay off the debt, you eliminate the debt, there are no more treasury securities anywhere. They're done. So why does that happen? Why does something that sounds so good and fiscally responsible, running budget surpluses and paying down debt, why does it tend to coincide with bad economic consequences? Why do we end up with depressions and the Great Recession? And very quickly, because we could talk for an hour just about, about this picture. But I want to just show you, this is where we were with Bill Clinton. That is the government's budget moving into surplus. You can see the red. That's the government's deficit. Government's almost always in deficit. But there were those 4 years right there under Bill Clinton when the government's budget moved into surplus. And there was great celebration, right? This is the first time in generations that the budget has been in surplus. This is the fiscally responsible thing to do. You know, Democrats delivered this. Well, yeah, but guess what? Look what happened to the private sector's financial position. Right? It was built on the backs of the private sector. The private sector's financial balance went deeply in the red, and that's what allowed the public sector's balance to move temporarily into the black. But it didn't last, and it can't last. Why? Because it was driven by primarily households spending more than their income, borrowing on the back of a dot-com bubble and then a housing bubble, and eventually the whole thing unravels. Too much debt, mostly for households. Inflation is every central banker's public public enemy number one. That's what he's worried about, okay? So can you imagine if instead of saying Social Security is going broke, we have to cut benefits, the system is unsustainable, forget all of that. If instead of that, we were saying, what are the things that we can do today? What are the investments we can make today to increase the odds that in 5, 10, 20 years, the US economy is productive enough that we can make good on all of those promises without causing an inflation problem? The Republicans would say what? Tax cuts and deregulation are the best ways to produce an economy that is, maximum growth and high productivity. And the Democrats would say what? Education, infrastructure, R&D, but at least we would be having the right debate. Right? At least we would be having a good, constructive, productive debate over the real issues that matter instead of this phony, where the money is running out sort of debate. The US government is never going to run out of the US dollar. The US government is the scorekeeper for the dollar. It can't run out of dollars any more than a carpenter can run out of inches, or the scorekeeper here at Stony Brook can run out of points when the football team is putting up 77 points in a game, and all the fans are sitting in the audience going, oh my God, what happens if they score again? They're never going to have enough points to put up. Yes, they will. They can't run out. The stadium can't run out of points. The US government can't run out of dollars. It's a unit, right? The government spends by instructing its bank to change the numbers in someone's account upward. That's how we pay for things. It's not actually by physically printing money and making payments. It's all done electronically. This is the debate I wish we were having. Instead of getting bogged down in the pay for question, focus on the real things that matter. What can we afford? The answer isn't in financial terms. The answer is in real terms. If we want to do $1 trillion of infrastructure and somebody says, how are you going to pay for it? You should say, I'm going to pay for it by hiring 300,000 construction workers, by using X tons of steel, by using 2 or 3% of our unused spare capacity in our factories, by mobilizing this many machines and heavy equipment. And so that's how you pay for it. Real resources. And if you don't have them, if the economy is already operating at full employment and everybody's being used, all the workers are already employed, all the resources are currently being used, then you can't afford it, right? But if you have spare capacity, if you have idle people, if you have idle machines, if the raw materials are there, then the government can step in and say, now would be a good time because we can mobilize these resources in a responsible way. That means without causing inflation, without competing for those resources with other people who are currently using. They're not being used. We can hire them, put them to work, and improve the standard of living, right? In the interest of the public good. So thank you very much.
All right, folks, this was, to me, one of the best short videos that describes most of the things that matter in modern monetary theory. I don't know how many of you all understood any of that, but quite frankly, to me, it seems like a pretty easy thing to understand. How many of you all, if you think about this, when you hear about modern monetary theory, and you hear about all these different aspects of MMT, how many of you all actually think to yourselves, wow, we can't afford anything. We can't afford these things. These people are crazy. I think we have a lot of people out there, quite frankly, who really believe that, who really believe that the United States is somehow or another broke, can't afford it, is completely and utterly destitute. Well, it's not true. So what I want to do is I want to give you the layperson's version of MMT. After you heard sort of, even though that was pretty down to earth, I could still tell that there are a lot of people out there that genuinely don't understand a lot of what was said. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a crack at it. The first thing that came to me was understanding who is a currency issuer and who is a currency user. And why does this matter? So people conflate the states, they conflate the federal government as one thing. They don't realize the economy is made up of a whole bunch of different entities that have different roles within it. The federal government created the dollar from thin air. It's just a unit of account. As she said in there, it's an inch or a dollar or a sound, a decibel. You can't run out of scores on the scoreboard. It's a unit of account. So the dollar isn't my precious. Dollars are created and they're destroyed every single day. As Warren Mosler would say, a dollar is nothing more than a tax credit. In other words, the dollar is going to always be redeemable for $1 in tax credit. Taxes are the only thing that can be paid with a dollar. Let me say it slightly differently. Your dollar is the only thing that can actually pay your obligation for taxes. You cannot pay your taxes in anything other than the US dollar. So that is what provides the value, if you will. That is what makes your dollar hold on to its ability to purchase things, is the fact that we tax in that dollar. So getting back to it, I said there's currency issuers and currency users. The federal government is the currency issuer. It created all the rules surrounding the dollar out of thin air. Every last one of them was created by a law, and it spoke the dollar into existence. The states are currency users. The states cannot create dollars at will. The states are dependent on the federal government to create them. So if you think about the way a lot of folks look at the economy, look at programs, look at the way they would like to see Medicare for all go out, look at the way they'd like to see a Green New Deal go out, there are a lot of people talking about how they'd like to have a local Green New Deal or a local Medicare for all or a local this or a local that, when the reality is that the federal government is the currency issuer. It spends the money into existence whenever Congress authorizes spending. Whenever it taxes, it deletes that money from existence. However, the states, they typically have to live on what they call a balanced budget. The states have to rely on tax revenues. This is pretty interesting when you think about it, because the federal government, most folks are thinking, is like their household budget. But it couldn't be anything further from the truth. The states are very, very much like your household budget in the sense that they can go broke. They must have tax revenues to pay their bills. They must have some sort of revenues, whether it be bonds or whatever. The federal government creates money every single time it spends. And every time it spends, it is a new dollar. It doesn't reuse dollars. Those dollars is the very first time they see the light of day is when they're spent into existence. And when they're deleted from existence is when they've been received as a tax. So does this make sense? Is this easy for you to understand? For me, it took a lot to understand that the economy was nothing more than really a circuit. When the federal government spends that money into existence, that's the very first time it sees the light of day. And when it deletes it, that's basically its death. It's done its job and it's put away. And it keeps going over and over and over again. Many, many moons ago, many moons ago, many of you all are too young to even remember this, but going back to 1971, Richard Nixon took us off of the gold standard. The gold standard, or the Bretton Woods Accord at the time, was a worldwide standard that pegged the currency, in other words, tied the value of the currency to a certain weight of gold. Well, Richard Nixon removed that, what we call a peg, and gave us a sovereign, free-floating, in other words, it doesn't have anything pegged to any commodity whatsoever. The value of the dollar rises and falls freely. So it's a sovereign, meaning the government itself is the powerful user, can spend it into existence at will. Free floating, meaning that it's not pegged to a currency or commodity. Non-convertible, in other words, you can't force demand them giving you a certain weight of gold in exchange for your dollar anymore. Your dollar is worth $1 in tax credit. So sovereign, free floating, non-convertible, fiat currency. In other words, by decree, it's the government's unit of account. So this oftentimes is something that many people haven't heard before either. They don't understand it. They're thinking gold standard. So when they talk about quantity of money, you're going to print too much money, it's going to cause inflation. You're going to print more money. It's constantly what you hear within the activist community, within the media, from your schools, etc. So many moons ago, Milton Friedman, who was a right-wing the king neoliberal himself, fraudulently came up with something called quantity theory of money. He fudged his numbers, and he used it as a battering ram or a stick to beat us down and keep us from believing that the government could spend money on the people. So people believe that anytime the government spends money, it's creating inflation. But they don't realize, again, every time the government taxes, it deletes money. So it doesn't just keep printing money into infinity. It actually is deleting that money, as it taxes. So I want you all to think about this for a minute. If in 1971 we were removed from the gold standard, if the fact that we tax money out of existence and that we no longer print money, because printing money was something we did when we were on the gold standard, what is it that constrains us? Why do they always tell us that we are broke? Why is it that the government is always, talking about how we've got to make tough decisions, we've got to cinch our belt up, we've got to, make really, really hard choices, and we got to cut spending, we got to reduce the deficit, we got to do all these things? I don't know the answer to that other than I can say that Roger Malcolm Mitchell would tell you that it's the gap, the whole gap, and nothing but the gap, which is the gap between the wealthy and the poor. They keep this in mind because they want to keep us from demanding too much. Because if you understand that the dollar isn't pegged to gold or anything and that the country can never go broke, all of a sudden you might start dreaming, what can I do with this money? What can we as a nation do now that we know that we're not constrained? It's something that we need to be able to talk about, and that's something that you heard in the video previously. So when you understand, number one, that we're on a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency, you understand that the government doesn't print money, that it spends money into existence when Congress authorizes it, and it taxes it out of existence when it's received as a tax. Why would we be wondering if we can afford Medicare for all? Why would we be wondering if we can afford a Green New Deal? Why would we be wondering if we can afford to get rid of student debt? Why would we think that we couldn't do great things? Well, there's a lot of mysticism that is baked into the economy today. And what I found for myself is that I didn't understand what the national debt was, because they keep trying to make it seem like we took out a credit card from China and that we're deeply in debt and that we're broke and this debt is just going to kill us. And they keep showing that debt clock, and that debt clock is scary because those are some really, really big numbers. And then they tell us about we got to reduce the deficit. Most people don't have a clue what the deficit is. And they just run around, we got to reduce the deficit. But this is a mind game. This is a game that goes back to the gold standard. We never updated our textbooks. We never updated any of the literature. We didn't even update the media. We didn't update our schools. We didn't update anything. So everyone is living in a fiat world, but by gold standard logic. It doesn't make any sense. Until you look at the bell curve from about 1978 all the way through present, you can clearly see back in the middle to late 70s, the wealth gap started exponentially growing and growing and growing because they had stopped spending on the people and they had started making us go into private debt. By going into private debt, we keep the economy going by borrowing bank money, by taking out a loan to buy a car, by taking out a loan to buy a house, by taking out a loan to go to college. So since the government wasn't fueling economic growth through spending and domestic spending, the government put the burden on the backs of the people to grow the economy by going deeper and deeper and deeper into private debt. Now, one of the things that Stephanie, I don't know if you saw it or not, but she kind of talked about something called sectoral balances. And sectoral balances are a very, very key component to modern monetary theory. Sectoral balances are how you measure where you are in an economy. Once you get down the currency user and the currency issuer part, once you get the sovereign free-floating fiat currency that's non-convertible part, once you understand the role of taxation is to drive currency, not for funding programs. It's just to fuel the economy, to keep that thing going, to keep the motor going. Once you understand that, then you have to ask yourself, where does the money go? How do we know when we should spend, when we should tax, et cetera, et cetera? And sectoral balances are a thing that goes beyond modern monetary theory, but it really informs modern monetary theory, and it measures three separate sectors. One is the public sector, two is the private sector, and three is what we call rest of world. So you look at the private sector and you say, hey, do we have a lot of room to grow debt there? Well, if you look at the United States right now, we have huge record levels of private debt, so much private debt, it will never be paid off. Never. You look at public debt. Well, public debt, quite frankly, is the one debt that we really never have to pay back because it's not debt like what you and I know. You and I, we have to borrow money from a bank or borrow it from somewhere. And when we get that money, we can't save it because we ultimately have to pay it back. So the federal government, however, doesn't have that because a lot of people want to save money. So the government has to spend enough money into the economy to adjust for saving desires. Or the third sector, which is rest of world, which is our balance of trade. Are we a net importer or are we a net exporter? Well, the United States has been a net importer now for many, many years to the tune of about $500 billion annually. That $500 million in trade deficit, if you will, has to be made up somewhere within the bathtub of the economy. Now, if you think about the bathtub being the full economy, all right, you understand that the water rises and falls depending upon how much economic activity is in it. And in this case, because the federal government has not spent on the people, and because the people are full of private debt, and because the nation doesn't have a net exporter stance, it is a net importer. Not only are we spending letting $500 billion a year go out of the country, but the people are tapped and they don't have room for more private debt. There's a huge student debt bubble ready to burst. There's lots and lots of corporate debt based on stock buybacks. There is a ton of just completely saturated, like overly burdened, overly debt burdened, industries and people in this country. So that leaves us with one area really to replace that money and keep the economy afloat. And that is the federal government deficit spending. Now, if you look at deficit spending, most people fear that because they think of deficits as their deficit. What they don't understand is that all of MMT is accounting. Almost all of it comes back to accounting identities. So one person's spending is another person's income. One person's deficit is another person's surplus. And if you look, the federal government, when it's in deficit, that means the non-governmental sector is in surplus. But what happens when the federal government is in surplus? Well, the federal government doesn't have a piggy bank with crumpled up old dollar bills in it. The federal government, when it receives money in a tax, deletes it. So a government surplus is kind of a misnomer because the government neither has dollars nor doesn't have dollars. The government spends money into existence. Interesting, right? So if you think about this, when you have a government deficit, that's our surplus, that's our savings, that's our private savings. Now you can quibble over where that savings is taking place, and it always seems to be taking place with the wealthy right now. Why is that? Well, it's because we haven't used our fiscal space. In other words, Congress hasn't spent money on the people in a very, very long time. So with that in mind, I want to take another stab at this and realize that when you're looking at the ledger, if you were watching it like a some sort of a graph, if you will, if you looked at the government side of the graph, it would be a mirror image on the non-government sector. You would have, if debt goes up here, then you would see savings go here. And bottom line is that the two sides will mirror each other because, again, one person's debt is another person's asset. One person's income is another person's spending. On and on. You see what I mean? This is how that accounting, double entry accounting game works. And MMT lives by accounting identities, tracing things back and forth across a ledger. It's not how you feel. It's not some idea that you had. It's the way it is on the accounting. And so MMT is unassailable because it literally traces the dollars back and forth. Now, one of the big things that comes up, as we all know, is this concept of the Federal Reserve. Well, the Federal Reserve was spoken into existence by Congress in 1913. And of course, there's an awful lot of conspiracy stuff that has gone around. There's an incredible amount of chitter-chatter about, the Federal Reserve owns America, and the Federal Reserve's a private institution, the Federal Reserve this and the Federal Reserve that. But the Federal Reserve is completely and utterly under the jurisdiction of Congress. Now, yes, they have some special rules that keep them sort of autonomous because it supposedly takes the politics out of the banking side. But we all know that's not true because the Federal Reserve has largely been captured, if you will, by the interests of neoliberalism. The corporate elite, etc., the banksters, as they call them, have really, really taken that, and they have made policies. They have chosen winners and losers based on a neoliberal paradigm which seeks to push us to financialize our existence while keeping us tapped and strained, needing to chase investments, needing to chase money that makes us in very compromised positions. Now, Congress could easily fix that. That's why MMT doesn't spend its time looking at the Federal Reserve as the problem. The reality is that Congress hasn't done its job. The reason there's so much bank money in existence is not just because banks have owned the country. It's because Congress has not done its job. If Congress spent on the people, The people wouldn't need to go to private banks to take out loans. The other thing is the banking industry has gone way out of field by financializing its own debt and building up a balance sheet made of speculative investments, and we've seen these boom-bust cycles repeatedly. It's time to make banking boring again, as Warren Mosler would say, and Ellis Winningham would say. And if you think about The Big Short, which wasn't exactly right, but it was close enough to right, we understand that there's an awful lot of things going on in the shadow banking world as well. That's for another talk. But for this talk, it's important to understand that banks are public purpose entities today. We have public banking today. The problem is that the very people that would need to create public banks today in the modern vernacular are the same people that have deregulated banks to be the demons they are and have created the environment we have that allows them to put us in really awful situations. It's important to understand the role that Congress plays in every bit of this. Congress alone has the authority to spend money, the power of the purse. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives them that authority. Now, just like a good manager can delegate authority, Congress has delegated its authority to the Federal Reserve, who has a shared balance sheet with the Treasury. So the Treasury will spend money from its accounts that it has marked up with keystrokes from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve doesn't just randomly print money or anything like that. The Federal Reserve waits on information from Congress. When Congress passes a bill, whatever, it makes entries into accounts and the money is spent. It's that simple. Now, I want to take us to the next piece, and that is called the Federal Job Guarantee. The Federal Job Guarantee is a very important component of modern monetary theory. In some ways, you could say the job guarantee is like a policy prescription, until you remember that the tax, the purpose of the tax, which we didn't address yet, is to in fact allow the government room to provision itself. The government issues a tax because if it didn't issue a tax, what would you do with these pieces of paper? Why would you go build a road? Why would you go build a castle? Why would you go build the Washington Monument? Or why would you, drive a truck for the government? Or why would you push a piece of paper for the government? Why would you fly an airplane for the government? Why would you do anything for the government? Because you need that piece of paper to pay your tax. And so the government issued a tax to drive the need for this currency. It's pretty simple when you think about it. But tax-driven money is what I'm sure there's other debt obligations possible. But the tax is what we typically use to drive the need for currency. You show up to work because you need to get a piece of paper. It's not just so you can pay for things and buy your house and stuff. It's because you have taxes you have to pay, payable only in that currency. If that wasn't the case, you might make different choices. Even with things like Bitcoin, you have to convert your Bitcoin to United States dollars in order to pay your taxes. Bitcoin is not a currency. It is a commodity. It is an envelope, if you will, a store of value that you put dollars into, basically, and it sends it on its way, it unpacks those dollars and floats around. But it is not a currency. The currency is still the United States government's unit of account. You don't have 30 Bitcoin, you have $300 of Bitcoin. So keep that in mind. In order for it to matter, your currency has to actually be accepted. All right, flash forward. One more thing. The United States debt is the sum total of every dollar that has not been taxed in existence today. It's more than just treasuries. It's every dollar from the dawn of history that has not been taxed. So if we pay off the national debt, what have we done? We have literally eliminated the money supply. Think about that, because all money is debt. The dollar is debt. It's all debt. It's debt in terms of it is able to be used in terms of settling an obligation. And that obligation is your tax liability. And it's also used to create buyers and sellers of goods. All right. Now, let's talk about Social Security for a moment. Long ago, FDR created the Social Security Administration, created the benefit that we call Social Security. And for many, many years, Americans have believed that when they pay FICA taxes, that they have quote-unquote paid into Social Security. Well, there is no old piggy bank with crumpled up old dollar bills in it. There's no hay pennies in it. There's no, there's nothing in it. It's a spreadsheet. This Social Security Trust Fund is nothing more than a spreadsheet. Every dollar spent from the Social Security is a new dollar. Every dollar collected in FICA taxes is deleted. The trust fund is merely an accounting thing. It's just merely tracking. It has nothing to do with anything. Those dollars could be expanded exponentially. They could be cut. They could be changed. We could add different categories to Social Security. It wouldn't matter at all. So the question is, if we expand Social Security or whatever, do we have a society, do we have an economy that's producing the goods and services required to meet the demand of the people receiving Social Security? It has nothing to do with solvency, because every dollar is just created with keystrokes. There is no shortage of dollars. There is a shortage of political will. There is a shortage of knowledge. But there isn't a shortage of dollars. Dollars are created at will. So this brings us to something called inflation. And there's a lot of different bits of inflation out there. But inflation is a persistent rise in the cost of overall goods. It's not just the rise of one good or service, or the rise in the price of your student loans, or the rise in the price of milk. Inflation is a persistent rise in prices across the board. So one of the things that we typically talk about with MMT, people ask, well, where's the limit on spending? How much can you spend? And the answer that MMTers say is that, hey, it's about real resources. It's not about balancing the budget. It's about balancing the economy. Do we have the real resources, the productive capacity, the factory capacity, the employment capacity, the real goods and services capacity to meet demand? If we do, then we can spend. If we don't, then we can't. We can't afford it then. But we've got a lot of slack in our economy. People have been forsaking getting their teeth fixed forever. They've been forsaking getting medical things taken care of forever. They've been forsaking getting their homes fixed. Things have been let go. Lots and lots of dilapidated buildings around the country, schools, you name it. So much room for us to spend because there is so much pent-up need for these things. And the real resources are there. So the idea of inflation really comes down to not have you printed too much money. That's quantity theory of money, and that's Milton Friedman, and that's not what it's about. The issue is, do we have enough goods and services available for purchase that people want to purchase with these dollars that they have? And I think you can look across the board and realize that we're a long way off. We've been trying to get inflation, and we can't get inflation. Places like Japan have a 250% debt to GDP ratio. They cannot get to 2% inflation. inflation is not a big deal at all. In fact, we're a long way off from it. Is inflation a concern? Absolutely. We always should balance against inflation. Now, is inflation always bad? No, it's not. Sometimes it's good to have some inflation. It expands the economy. It lessens the need or the burden on debt holders. It allows people to get out of debt quicker with inflation. There's a whole bunch of different things that make an it depends kind of answer. This brings us to the next question, and that's hyperinflation. You hear a lot of people talking about hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a rejection of the currency. And it happens way before we ever print money or anyone prints money. It's usually brought on by political corruption or foreign debt denominated in a foreign currency that makes the local currency useless because there's not enough productive capacity to meet the demand. So let's start with a couple of the favorites. Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is an agricultural community. Mugabe, who was the leader, he took away the farmland from seasoned farmers that knew how to make the crops grow and knew how to distribute it, etc., and gave it to the black farmers who were untrained and unskilled at the time. And what had ended up happening was the entire productive capacity of Zimbabwe was decimated. And they didn't have the productive capacity to meet the demand. And so it didn't matter how much money they printed, they only had so many vegetables for people to eat, and they were desperate for it. And so you saw a perpetual rise in prices to the point where they had a hyperinflation. The printing of money happened well after the fiasco that Mugabe did. The next one, another favorite, is Weimar Republic. Weimar Republic is going back to Nazi Germany. Even before Nazi Germany, we're talking about the results of the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was extremely cruel and harsh, and the people of Germany were decimated. The debts that were put onto Germany were payable only in French francs. So the German people couldn't print Reichsmarks. They couldn't print the German Reichsmark to pay their debts. They could only do it in French francs. So that meant their entire productive capacity, all their goods and services were sent elsewhere. They didn't have the ability. And so in order to get bread, they just kept printing money, and you could see barrels of Reichsmarks and so forth laying around. And that, my friends, is how Germany ended up having a hyperinflation. It wasn't about printing money. It was about the fact that they were decimated by debt denominated in a foreign currency. And they were unable to meet the productive capacity that was required for the people who demanded food and water and basic sustenance. They couldn't even keep up with that. So then the printing of money commenced, and there was the hyperinflation. Again, neither Zimbabwe nor Weimar Republic had anything to do with printing money. It was always political corruption, foreign debt, a diminished capacity in terms of producing goods and services, etc. Think about that. People talk about hyperinflation like it just happens all the time. It doesn't. And it's not about fiat currency. It's not about any of that. It's about 100% about political corruption, foreign debt, inability to meet demand. There you have it. And there's a bunch of others that we could touch on, but at this point in time, it's the one and the same. Venezuela, lots of foreign debt, a single commodity in terms of oil-based products. The foreign markets were able to drop the bottom of it. Their debt was denominated in foreign currency. They couldn't pay for it with their own currency. They printed more money, hyperinflation. They weren't able to keep up with demand. Boom, another one. And there was a lot of political corruption, courtesy of the United States, I'm sure. But that's not really MMT. That's just sort of fodder for you. But again, Venezuela wasn't about printing money either. Venezuela was about corruption, a single commodity that was able to be messed with by the global community, and an inability to meet the production demands of their countrymen and women. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and bring up another article. And this one right here is by Fidel. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me bring this up. This one right here is by L. Randall Ray. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this with you momentarily. And he basically, in this article, he lays out the things that he considers part of modern monetary theory. And I want to go ahead and just read through a few of them and see if this measures up with what you heard and maybe fills in some of the gaps. He says, let me finish with 10 bullet points of what I include in MMT. He says, what is money? An IOU denominated in a socially sanctioned money of account. In almost all known cases, it is the authority of the state that chooses the money of account. I was calling it a unit of account. He's calling it money of account. This comes from Knapp, Innes, Keynes, Jeff Ingram, and Minsky, Hyman Minsky. The second thing he adds, taxes or other obligations, fees, fines, tributes, tithes, drive the currency. The ability to impose such obligations is an important aspect of sovereignty, monetary sovereignty. Today, states alone monopolize this power. Now, when he's talking about states, he's not talking about like Texas and New York City. He's talking about states like as in Russia, the state, not states, not the small states, but the state. And he says, the ability to impose such obligations is an important aspect of sovereignty. Today, states alone monopolize this power. This comes from Knapp, Innes, Minsky, and Mosler. That would be Warren Mosler, the father of modern monetary theory. The third thing he brings up is anyone can issue money. The problem is getting it accepted. Anyone can write an IOU denominated in the recognized money of account, but acceptance can be hard to get unless you have the state backing you up. This is Minsky. See how he's pointing to an economist who came up with this? So you're not just saying, oh, it's just MMT creating something. No, it's just got roots going way back. The fourth thing he says, the word redemption is used in two ways, accepting your IOUs in payment and promising to convert your IOUs to something else, such as gold, foreign currency, or state IOUs. The first is fundamental and true of all IOUs. Our gold bugs mistakenly focus on the second meaning, which does not apply to the currencies issued by most modern nations, and indeed does not apply to most of the currencies issued throughout history. This comes from Innes and Knapp, and is reinforced by Hudson's and Grubb's work, as well as by Margaret Atwood's great book, Payback, Debt and the Shadow Side of Wealth. The fifth thing he brings up, sovereign debt is different. There is no chance of involuntary default so long as the state only promises to accept its currency in payment. Remember I said the state imposes a tax payable only in its currency? This is what he's saying right here. So sovereign debt is different. There is no chance of involuntary default so long as the state only promises to accept its currency in payment. That's why you're not going to see Bitcoin and other things accepted as payment. It could voluntarily repudiate its debt, but this is rare and has not been done in any modern nation, sovereign nation. So functional finance should be functional. This is number 6. To achieve the public purpose, not sound to achieve some arbitrary balance between spending and revenues. Most importantly, monetary and fiscal policy should be formulated to achieve full employment. The job guarantee, we were talking about that a little bit ago, job guarantee eradicates involuntary unemployment because the state imposes a tax which creates the first unemployed person, which therefore means that we've got to solve for that. If you're going to create unemployment, you better have an answer for unemployment, and that's what the federal job guarantee is. Okay. So he says, this is credited to Abba Lerner, who was introduced into MMT by Matt Forstater. In its original formulation, it's too simplistic, summarized as two principles: increase government spending or reduce taxes, and increase the money supply if there is unemployment, due to the reverse of if there is inflation. The first of these is fiscal policy, and the second is monetary policy. A steering wheel metaphor is often invoked using policy to keep the economy on course. A modern economy is far too complex to steer as if you were driving a car. If unemployment exists, I love this, here we go. If unemployment exists, is not enough to say that you can't just reduce the interest rate, raise government spending, or reduce taxes. The first might even increase unemployment. The second two could cause unacceptable inflation, increase inequality, or induce financial instability long before they solve the unemployment problem. I agree that government can always afford to spend more, but the spending has to be carefully targeted to achieve the desired result. I'd credit all my institutionalist influences for that one, including Minsky. Now remember, when we spend on the people, instead of just the military, when we spend domestically on the people, that's getting the money into the hands of the people, and that's the kind of good spending he's talking about here. For the reason the JG is a critical component of MMT, it's number 7, it anchors the currency and ensures that achieving full employment will enhance both price and financial stability. This comes from Minsky's earliest work on the employer of last resort, ELR, from Bill Mitchell's work on buffer stocks, and Warren Mosler's work on monopoly price setting. So Warren Mosler would say that the federal government is the price setter, is the monopoly issuer of the currency. And bottom line here is that the federal job guarantee stabilizes the economy. It is a superior automatic stabilizer, and it is a necessity. It's not just about whether or not you want people to work or you want a UBI or any of that other stuff. It is about stabilizing the economy. Okay? All right. So number 8 is, and also for that reason, we need Minsky's analysis of financial instability. Here I don't really mean the financial instability hypothesis. I mean the whole body of work, and especially the research line that began with his dissertation written under Schumpeter up through his work on money manager capitalism at the Levy Institute before he died. Now, folks, this is heady stuff. I wouldn't expect you to know this. Some of this stuff, I don't know. But I'm reading it to you, and we can always do what most people do with the internet, and that is, let me Google that for you. It's easy enough to find these things out. Be careful of your sources, though. Most people out there pick mainstream sources that are economically illiterate. Okay. Number 9, the government's debt is our financial asset. Remember, I was telling you about the two sides of the ledger, right? One person's debt, another person's asset, and so forth. This follows from the sectoral balance approach of Wynne Godley. Remember, I said that as well. Talked about the 3 sectors, private, public, and rest of world. So we have to get our macro accounting correct. Minsky always used to tell students to go home and do the balance sheets because what you are saying is nonsense. Fortunately, I had learned T accounts from John Randall in Sacramento, who also taught Stephanie Kelton from his own great money and banking textbook. It's all there, including the impact of budget deficits on bank reserves. Godley taught us about stock flow consistency, and he insisted that all mainstream macroeconomics is incoherent. Now, one of the things that I wanted to say in the previous thing is that banks don't lend reserves. Reserves stay within the banking system. They never are lent out. And so you oftentimes hear people talk about the fractional reserve system. Well, it doesn't exist. Never. It existed maybe back in 1934 when we were on the original gold standard, but it does not exist now, and it has not existed in a very, very long time. Banks are not reserve constrained, and they can lend pretty much at will, and that's why we need to regulate banks. It's why we need to make them act like public institutions serving the public purpose once again. But they are public purpose. They just are very, very bastardized now because Congress has not done its job. You want to blame somebody? Blame Congress. All right. Number 10, and this is the last of his points. Rejection of the typical view of the central bank as independent and potent. Monetary policy is weak, and its impact is at best uncertain. It might even be mistaking the brake pedal for the gas pedal. The central bank is the government's bank, so can never be independent, period. Treasury and the Fed have a consolidated ledger, period. They're one and the same. They work together. All this gibberish you've heard, it's gibberish. Creature from Jekyll Isle, maybe some historical anecdotes that are fun to talk about when you're playing Trivial Pursuit, but they don't really serve any value. The bank of today, the way we have it, they have a consolidated balance sheet, period. One and the same. And that's what he's saying here. So he's saying the central bank is the government's bank, so can never be independent. Its main independence is limited to setting the overnight rate target, and it is probably a mistake to let them even do that. Permanent ZIRP, aka zero interest rate policy, ZIRP, is probably a better policy since it reduces the compounding of debt and the tendency for the rentier class to take over more of the economy. In other words, the bonds that we sell are basically a basic income for the wealthy, but it's not debt because we keystroke that stuff into existence. He says, I credit Keynes, Minsky, Hudson, Mosler, Eric Timonet, and Scott Fulwiler for much of the work on this. And that right there is Randall Wray's short list of 10 things that he actually focuses on. Now, I think that it's worth talking about that for a minute. Randall Wray is one of the leading voices of modern monetary theory. You think about the development team, you think about Warren Mosler first and foremost. You think of William Bill Mitchell out of Australia. You think of L. Randall Wray. You think of Stephanie Kelton. You think of people like Matt Forstater and Scott Fulwiler and Pavlina Cherneva and Fidel Kaboub and a whole host of others. You think of the Modern Money Network with Rohan Gray and Raul Carrillo. You think of other individuals throughout different generations of people that have learned this stuff and have been a part of it. You think about Stephen Hale from Australia, And then you start thinking about folks like deficit owls and real progressives and others that have taken the ball and run with it as well. You even got guys like Mike Norman who have done great work, and Ellis Winningham, of course, who's been with real progressives throughout. And you have him writing his own stuff. And Ellis is one of the best economists that I know, best voices, best explainers of modern monetary theory that I've ever met. Him and Fidel Kaboub do great work. So does Dr. Hale. In any event, I wanted to make a point, though, that of all these voices out there, they don't get a voice in the mainstream journals of economics. They don't get a voice on TV very often. So when you see Stephanie Kelton on mainstream media, That's a really big deal because they try and shut the door on heterodox economics. Heterodox just means outside the norm. And MMT, modern monetary theory, is a description of macroeconomics. And it really is largely a description of macroeconomics since the end of the Bretton Woods Accord on a sovereign free-floating fiat currency. And it describes what the implications are when we spend, when we tax, when we write policy. How do we gauge it? How do we view it? And that brings us to the Green New Deal, which is where we're at today. And much of the discussions that you see out there are making fun of MMT. They're trying to denigrate it, when in reality it's great, deep academic work, tremendous studies, deep scientific work done by the likes of Bill Mitchell, who wrote a phenomenal book called Reclaiming the State. And here shortly, the new modern monetary theory known as macroeconomics textbook will be coming out. Martin Watts, Bill Mitchell, and this is one of those things where MMT is coming into its own. And you see people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepping up and really saying, hey, the answer to the question of how we're going to pay for it is, how did you come up with $700 billion for the military without taxing? In fact, by cutting taxes. In fact, why don't we go ahead and reduce taxes on the people? These are the kinds of things we could do. Let's tax wealth. Let's tax land. Let's tax rentier class. Let's tax investment income. Let's tax things that are not productive. But when we look at the Green New Deal, we don't need to raise taxes to pay for the Green New Deal. No, what we need to do is understand what real resources we need to pull off the Green New Deal. And that will tell us whether we can afford it or not. Do we have enough labor in America right now? Or do we need immigrant labor? Oh my goodness. How do we gauge, do we have the real resources for Medicare for All? Another buzzword, another important program that's out there. Warren Mosler would tell us that Medicare for All is actually deflation and would require a tax cut, not a tax increase. See, modern monetary theory actually thinks through the problem. It doesn't just say, well, of course we've got to raise taxes. It's how we pay for things. MMT strips away every lie that's out there. Every single lie, it strips it away. And it just shows you the bare naked truth. And then you can have a legitimate conversation about what your priorities are, what you think matters, as opposed to fending off lies about the Rothschilds or the this or the that. You just focus purely on the economic value of the public purpose. What is it we want to do? What society do we want? How do we prioritize the real resources that we have available to us? Now, before I show you this last bit, which is Warren Mosler's 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, I want to talk just a little bit about Europe and the United States. So, Greece is a country that is absolutely mired in debt. It has no prayer of digging out unless there's a debt jubilee that's given to them, or they go back on the drachma, which is their old sovereign currency that they gave up to get onto the euro. Well, in Europe, unlike the United States, they have a non-state bank. They have the Troika. They have the European Central Bank. No one state runs the European Central Bank. So when Greece, which is a net importer by far and away, has problems because their money is leaving the country and they can't bring enough taxes in to keep their country afloat, they have to borrow. And by borrowing, they've put themselves in tremendous hardship because they are in debt denominated in a currency that is not sovereign to them. They do not have control over. So you look in Europe and you say, well, which countries are succeeding with the euro and which ones are failing? You look at Germany, and Germany, of course, is the shining star of the region because Germany is a net exporter. And you can look at the United States and you could say, the states that have low taxes bring all the businesses in, but they also remove the services because the businesses demand sweetheart deals. And this is how the race to the bottom in the United States happens, and it's how the race to the bottom in Europe happens as well. And it's very important to understand the United States is nothing like Greece. The United States has its own sovereign currency. Forget the silly stuff about the Federal Reserve. For the love of God, forget the nonsense. But Greece doesn't have any of that flexibility. They gave it up. So they're like the state. They're like West Virginia. They're like Michigan. They're like California. Well, not like California because California's got a huge economy. But in Europe, those states, you have to look. Are they a net importer or are they a net exporter? How much private debt do they have? Are they able to enforce a tax? And it really becomes a game of understanding those sectoral balances. It's very important to understand there, and it's very important to understand it in our own states, in the United States. Many states in America have an unfair advantage because what they've done is they've got more real resources, they've got tons of sweetheart deals for business, and they lure these businesses away and they leave pockets of destitute people. The capital flight occurs because the states are not sovereign currency issuers, and the states pull down the businesses like Texas and Kansas did, where they dropped their tax rate down to nothing, basically, decimated the social structure, but they lured business down there. The race to the bottom. That's why we don't have Flint, Michigan water taken care of. It's inexcusable. That's why Puerto Rico is so screwed up. It's not because Puerto Rico screwed up. It's because our freaking federal government has made a decision not to spend money into that island nation or into that island territory, as it were, or into Michigan, where they have a real legitimate national emergency as opposed to the wall that Donald Trump is trying to get built. So I want you to understand that relationship with currency issuers, the federal government, and the states, which are currency users, Europe, which has a ECB, which is not a sovereign in terms of for a state. It like overrides the whole thing. So no state, that's not their sovereign currency. They can't make a choice to spend more out of thin air. They've got to borrow it. And that, my friends, is why the Eurozone in Europe is really, really screwed, because it's created a neoliberal hell that causes privatization, causes predatory lending, causes all kinds of stuff that creates really, really horrible situations for the people. All right, so the last thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and show you Warren Mosler's 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds. And this right here is, I'm just going to show you the 7 key things here. And let me go ahead and do this. And shrink this over a little bit. Hopefully I'll be able to do this in short order. Unfortunately, I have this feeling it's not going to let me do it the way I'd like to do it. Maybe? Nope. There we go. All right, so let me move my mug shot over. So right here, if you look over here at the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, okay? He says the government must raise funds through taxation or borrowing in order to spend. In other words, government spending is limited by its ability to tax or borrow. Now, folks, we've already debunked that, and that's why this is 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. This is from Warren Mosler's book. It's a very important book. It is ground zero of MMT, quite frankly. The next one, the second one, with government deficits, we are leaving our debt burden to our children. Well, that's not true, because taxes neither fund spending nor is the debt a big deal, because it's not debt to foreign countries. And when I say that, it's not a foreign currency, right? We're not borrowing Chinese yuan or Japanese yen or euros. We're borrowing United States dollars that we create ourselves. And it's not really borrowing. It's just there's no better term for it, right? And so these things are basically savings accounts. These treasury bonds are time savings accounts that people, when they buy and sell goods and services in the United States, they have a decision. Do I just let my money sit here in the Fed, or do I put it into a bond and let it grow interest? Well, hell, I think I'll go ahead and put it into a bond that sells, makes some interest. It's not debt that we have to pay back. Not in the sense of, oh my God, it's debt to our children. So that's a fraud. The third one, government budget deficits take away savings. Well, that's absolutely not true, because a government's deficit is private savings. Fourth one, Social Security is broke. Well, we know that that's not true. If we have a brain, we think about it. All Social Security is keystrokes anyway. So how in the world could it be broke? Because they're holding on to the spreadsheet called the trust fund. The trust fund is a joke. It's not real. It's horse crap. And it even says, I don't have the document here, but I'll find the link and I'll try and put it in this chat at some point. Truth is that the trust funds are just a joke. There is no such thing as raiding the trust fund spreadsheet. Every time they spend, Congress authorizes spending, and Social Security checks are cut. That's it. Period. End of story. It can't go broke. It's ridiculous. And so it's time that we stop allowing our friends to expand the cap and do all these things, when in reality, Social Security could be expanded to serve as a basic income. It could cover a host of things from disability, you name it. There's absolutely no reason Social Security is in danger at all. The reason they try and tell you that is because they are trying to get us to go into Wall Street, where Wall Street can once again financialize and capitalize on our lives. I don't want that. I don't think you want it either. Next. The fifth innocent fraud. The trade deficit is an insurmountable imbalance that takes away jobs and output. Well, this is something I didn't talk about much, but we should. So I will for a minute. If you are buying goods and services from around the world, and they're taking your piece of paper, the world reserve currency, right? Well, there's a whole basket of world reserve currencies, right? The United States is just one of them. Happens to be the dominant one, but it's not a big time thing. It's not a big deal. It's more of a convenience than anything. That said, if we run a trade deficit, in other words, we're a net importer, and $500 billion is leaving our country, that is not a big deal. We're trading pieces of paper or digits for their real goods and services. We're trading paper for real resources. Not a bad deal. Not a bad deal. And the reason why this is not a big deal on the jobs, because we can spend sovereign money into our own economy to offset any trade imbalance. And there's no such thing as a trade imbalance, because it always balances. It's just a matter of we have a deficit in terms of we are a net importer. So we import more than we export. That's it. Government has the full flexibility to write a bill, write a law, and offset that without any problem whatsoever, other than the fact that you and I believe that we should bring the jobs back, bring the manufacturing back. We got to twist the ties on the Tootsie Pops, right? No, we don't. That's the federal job guarantee. That's a million things. We could spend on a Green New Deal. We can have real green jobs that go beyond the base level. The job guarantee is the wage floor. It sets the wage floor, and all of a sudden, anybody that wants a job can have a job. Federally funded, locally administered. Think about this. Why in the world do you want to bring back manufacturing jobs? Why would you want to do that? It's ridiculous. You're not thinking clearly. Warren Mosler says that it's actually a cost to be an exporter because we're sending real resources out of the country while we're bringing back their pieces of paper. Think about that. Think about that for a minute. All right, the next one is we need savings to provide the funds for investment. Well, no, we don't. The United States government creates money at will. At will. Completely at will. It's just silly. We don't have to have that at all. The United States government doesn't save money. Stop trying to save the federal government money. It's not your tax dollars. The government creates money every time it spends, and it deletes money every time it taxes. Every time. And the last one, it's a bad thing that higher deficits today mean higher taxes tomorrow. Well, only if you follow Paul Krugman is that true. It's bullshit. The chef's salad is what it is. We don't have to raise taxes. We don't have to balance the budget. We just need to balance the economy and make it work for people again. No matter what the deficit is, it doesn't matter. What matters is, do we have the real resources available to absorb the spending? So just keep this in mind as you hear people talk about the petrodollar. What is the petrodollar? It's a numeraire. Do you know what a numeraire is? It's nothing more than a numbering convention. It's a way of assessing a value. It doesn't actually provide value to our dollar. We've chosen to price gasoline in dollars. We've chosen to price bananas in banana dollars. We've chosen to price Scooby snacks in Scooby snack dollars. It's not a big deal. But yet, the Alex Jones community of our world has decided to make it a big deal. And sadly, and this is the worst part, sadly, it didn't stay in the right wing with Alex Jones. Some lefties started talking petrodollars too. So that disgusting scourge of Alex Jones eked into the progressive movement. And now we've got to purge that. We got to purge it. We got to get that shit out of us. It's a virus. And we got to get rid of it. All right, so I am going to close this part out, and I'm going to come back here to the main ticker, and I'm going to tell you something. The Green New Deal isn't a matter of convenience. The Green New Deal is not just an economic boom for people. It's not just a job program. Folks, the IPCC put a report out that said we had 12 years, and that was a year ago. We've got 11 years to mitigate some of the worst dangers that climate change can bring on us. Now, that doesn't mean we have 11 years to act. It means we have 11 years to fix it, to get to a carbon neutral, to reverse, to come to a zero emissions. Wow, that's going to be a hell of a thing, right? Maybe it's not possible. But wouldn't you want to die trying if that's the case? Think about the World War II mobilizations that we had to go through. We had our factories going at full capacity. Every man, woman, and child was working. We had no excess capacity. That's what we're going to need to do to address climate change. And in the meantime, it's going to help our economy. In the meantime, it's going to help our environment. In the meantime, it's going to carve out a new way of living, a sustainable way of living that's going to create millions and millions of green jobs. Not just job guarantee level jobs that are, the base wage. We're talking about high-end jobs. Jobs that we all could get, things that we could strive for. Things that are way better than just the base wage. Professional level career work. All of a sudden now, people will have choices. This Green New Deal gives us the option of mobility, which we haven't had in this country in a very long time. Stay-at-home parents, whether it be a husband or a wife, will have the option to do different things. People that have been in abusive situations don't have to stay in them anymore. People that are stuck in cities that aren't serving them don't have to stay there anymore. People will be able to get up and go, and they will be able to have a job, federally funded, locally administered. That is what the Green New Deal offers, amongst a host of other opportunities to alter the way we put emissions into the air and get away from fossil fuels and so forth. Is it doable? Is it achievable? Beyond the shadow of a doubt it is. Every bit of this is. And so when you read the newspapers and when you watch the news and you see all these hit pieces on modern monetary theory or mocking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about how she's going to pay for it, well, you know that they're just talking out their patootie. They're just completely screwbarred. They're wrong. They're incorrect. And it's up to us, you and I, to get that word out to activists, voters, non-activists, couch potatoes, media personalities, alternative media personalities, town halls, our local papers, our presidential candidates. If you hear a presidential candidate talking about your hard-earned tax dollar and paying for programs with raising taxes, you hear them talking about incremental change, and you hear them talking about very, very weak earned benefits like Gillibrand and others. Just say no way. No way, Kamala. No way, Corey. No way, gang. You produce citizens' benefits, public purpose spending. Stop trying to make neoliberal policies sound like they're good. They're not. They're terrible. They're awful. It's time to start serving the people. And that's what modern monetary theory gives you. So MMT is a lens. It is a way of viewing the economy. It is macroeconomic reality. It is operational reality. And there's a ton of information out there. Don't go to non-MMT people asking them about MMT. That's for you, Lee Camp, who always goes to non-MMTers. That's for others out there that always go to non-MMTers asking them to talk about MMT. Go to the MMTers. Step up. Be accounted for. This is ridiculous that so many people go to these people that have no clue about MMT and ask them to tell them about MMT. What the hell is that? Seriously, hey, can you, Donald Trump, I'm looking for you to give me a little bit of a lesson on what it's like to be a young black man in the south of France, or, in Compton. Donald Trump, can you please tell us a little bit of a story about what it's like to be an indigenous person in Dakota? It's stupid. Why would you ask somebody that doesn't know MMT, that isn't an MMTer, about MMT? Don't do it. Go to the source. Go to the people that know MMT. And the people that are saying things about it that don't understand it, they don't understand it. We've been lied to for so long. Why would they? Sometimes it's hard to be kind to people when they don't know this stuff, because they say things that you get tired of debunking. And it's very, very hard to let them off the hook because they say it with such confidence. Oh, the dollar will crash when the petrodollar, say it with that like teen angst. You can almost see the goth hair. It's really hard to cut them slack. I'm not going to lie. Not going to lie. It's really, really hard. So just do your homework. The information's there. It's very, very difficult to screw this up once you understand. And I can tell you right now, there's about 1 million things I didn't say tonight that I could have said. Here, I got this little thing right here that Real Progressives made right here. And I think this is kind of neat. I don't know if you can see it. It's kind of cool. Hopefully you can. This right here is one of our leave behinds. And it's kind of cool. And you can find this on our website. And, some of the things that, I think are important for us to know are that we can indeed afford nice things. We can indeed afford to take care of people and planet. And we don't have to make hard choices when it comes to things that are like, oh, do the rich not get more money? Or do the poor have to die? Now, when you drive into a local city sometime and you see people freezing, you need to understand that's a political choice. It's not necessary. We can afford to take care of them. We can afford housing. We can afford food. We can afford health care. Affordability is not the issue. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of Calvinism still left in America today. Well, if you did better, you'd made a better choice, then you would be able to have better things. Hard work will get you where you need to be. Well, we know that's horseshit. We know that's not true. We know it's a lottery. It's a gamble. And once you fall off the wagon, it's almost impossible to get back on. The economy is built like a casino. You go into it, and most times you walk out with nothing. Sometimes not even the clothes on your back. So with that, I'm hoping that you all take some of these lessons, take some of this information, and teach somebody. Learn, find videos. Deficit Owls is out there. They've got great information. A lot of it is our videos, which is nice. But don't waste this time. Don't start cheering for Tulsi and Bernie and all the other ones yet. We need people to learn economics, or we're going to get stuck with a neoliberal that doesn't know it. And then we're going to end up screwed. It truly is in our hands. And with that, my name's Steve Grumbine. I'm with Real Progressives, and I hope you have a great day.